Have you ever, I don't know, every so often, I read something in the Bible and I wonder, how could that be? Right? Here's an easy one. How could it be that there were two of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, every kind of creature that moved along the earth on Noah's boat? How could that be? How about you? What in the Bible has ever prompted you to say or think, how could that be? The Red Sea. How could that be? Parting the Red Sea. Rhymes. How could that be? Anyone else? Something off the top of your head? Ah, what a tale to be swallowed by a... How could that be? Going down into the depths of the sea. Here's one I've been wondering about this week. Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, if you have your Bibles, Jesus is going around. He's forgiving and healing a paralyzed man. He calls Matthew. Then he raises a dead girl. He heals a sick woman. Then he heals the blind and those who are mute. And you get to the end of Matthew chapter 9, and Matthew offers this summary of what has been going on. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, and you've heard this passage, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Here's what grabs me about this passage, and it's maybe not the part that we're familiar with, but it's the line, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching, preaching, and healing. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. As far as I've been able to find out, in Jesus' day, there were in Palestine about 120 towns and villages. Population of Palestine in Jesus' day, probably about 1 million, not about the same as we have here in our province, but compressed in a very much smaller area, of course. The area that Jesus hung around, primarily Jesus hangs around in Galilee. I was going to point here. Galilee, up in the northern area, probably population in the tens of thousands. So I will say 10 to 30,000. So here's what I wonder about. The picture that we have for Matthew is Jesus going from one town to the other, through all the towns and villages, and connecting with thousands of people, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, healing their diseases and illnesses. Now, we read that many times Jesus has to get away from the crowds, right? He has to get away from people, so he would retreat to the hills, he would go across the lake and just spend time in prayer, spend time alone with God. But on this occasion, and I don't know how long a period of time this is, but he's going from place to place to place. And he has a full itinerary, very full itinerary. Tens of thousands of people, more than 100 villages and towns, preaching the kingdom, healing every disease and illness. I feel tired just thinking about all that. But Jesus, here's what I wonder about. Jesus felt differently. When he sees the crowds, he has compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So it's not so much that I wonder about Jesus going physically from town to town. What I wonder about is how could Jesus do that on a heart level, encountering all these people and having compassion on them. When I look at crowds, sometimes it's hard for me to have compassion on them, right? In a crowded store, you go to venture for my annual or biannual trip to Costco. It's hard to have compassion on the crowds at Costco. Compassion, crowds, Costco. 3 C's don't go together. Crowded streets, right? Driving in the city. Crowded traffic, annoying, right? Peeve me, hassle me. Compassion, probably not the first thing that comes to mind. And yet, here we have Jesus with the busiest period, I think, of his earthly ministry, looking on the crowds, maybe hundreds of them at a time. We know that at times he's feeding thousands of them, but maybe in these cases, hundreds of them at a time. And his heart breaks for them. They are like sheep. He sees them for what they really are. They're like sheep without a shepherd. They're harassed. They're helpless. They're making up life as they go along. And they don't know who they are. They don't know where they're going, what they're doing. How could Jesus do that? Better question is, how can I do that? How can I be someone? How could we be people who see crowds of people as Jesus saw them? How can we be people who look at people not for what they're saying, not for what they're saying to us, not for what they're doing to us, but how can we see them for who they really are? Teachers going back to school this week, students coming to you. Some students have a history. Some students, you've already got a mental picture of who they are, how they're going to be. But how can you see them for who they really are? Those of you who are in job situations, those of you who are in political positions, complaints, the customer is always right. How can we be people who look at people not for what they're saying to us, not for what they're doing to us, but who they really are? Can we reject the conditioning of our culture to see people as objects? Complainer, troublemaker, class disruptor, town fool. That conditioning is subtle, but it's constant. I've named a few, but there's others, right? We talk about all the old people, and they just become objects. They're all old people, and they're not real people with real hearts, real interests. They're old people. or young people. Young people. Young people these days. Or those people from over there. They've just become things in our eyes, objects, and we can easily dismiss them. They're just old people, they're just young, they're just from over. But when we see people as subjects rather than objects, then we see people who are complex, people who are marvelous, people who are wonderfully rich, people who are created in the image of our God and Father. It's not only seeing others as God sees them, maybe it's seeing others as I would like you to see me. I'm not just an old guy. And whatever else you call me. Jesus sees the crowds not as objects, but as subjects, people who are worth his interest, his attention. And we who follow Jesus, as he wades into all of these crowds, can we be people who have that same vision? Can we see people as subjects rather than objects? And that is a really, really tough temptation to resist, to treat people as objects. Have you met so and so here? He would be a really good contact for you. Well, why would it be good for me to meet so and so? Well, is it because he's complex? Is he marvelous? Is he just a fascinating person to interact with? No. It's because he might be able to help you in some way. Or maybe he knows people that you should know. In other words, he or she is a good thing that you could use to advance or get something done. It's probably not much different for you in your context. You know, when you're standing in line, you're waiting for the next available teller at the bank, or you're standing in line at Co-op, waiting to check out your groceries, and the person in front of you is taking much, much too long. They could pay that bill online or at the ATM. Do you really need change today? The scanner at the Co-op isn't working? What? And so that person in front of you, taking all the time, is no longer a person. You don't know what their name is. Doesn't matter. You don't care what her day has been like. You don't care what he's going through. She's a thing that is not doing what you expect, what you want. He is, or she is, one thing and one thing only. Something that is holding up the line. And so we capitulate to the temptation to treat a person as an object. The Bible, over and over again, demonstrates that the God And this is how could it be that the God of the universe always sees people as subjects, not as objects? And what we discover in Jesus Christ is the most stunning expression of God in the flesh. Here we have God in the flesh, a person who dares to imagine that everybody he encounters is worthy of his attention. Worthy of his attention. And so Jesus treats everybody like subjects. And he goes to all of the towns and all of the villages, and he heals every disease and every sickness. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we get these snapshots of Jesus engaging with the most unlikely people. People who in Jesus' day were always viewed as objects. People like women, people who were sick, Romans, children. They were just groups that were treated as objects. They weren't given any attention in Jesus' day. But time and time again, Jesus engages whoever he happens to encounter, and he treats people as subjects, not as objects. That's the only way we're going to learn to love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus says, treat neighbors and others as subjects rather than objects. You know, we're really here in disguise for Jesus. We are to be little Jesuses in the lives of people that we meet and encounter. And when we see people as Jesus sees people, it can change lives. When we see people as Jesus sees them, we will also be called to prayer. We will ask the Lord of the harvest to send more workers into his harvest. And when we see people as Jesus sees them, we will be called into mission, into the lives and the spaces of people we know and love, people we see not as objects, but as subjects. You may have one of these bracelets or whatever all the paraphernalia lying around somewhere at home. 20 years ago now, I guess. More than 20 years. You know what this WWJD? What would Jesus do? Actually, goes back more than 20 years. Goes back to the early 1900s when there was a widely read book by Charles Sheldon entitled In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? You may have read that. And then it had a resurgence, actually. What comes around goes around, or what goes around comes around. And in the 1990s, everybody had, I didn't, but lots of you had your WWJD bracelets, right? Or did you have a? Anyways, maybe you weren't even born in the 90s. I don't know. It's a good question to ask ourselves when we see people as Jesus sees them. What would Jesus do? But what if we broaden that question? Enlarge it. If Jesus were 43 years of age, if Jesus were 27 years old, if Jesus was 53 years of age, if he had as much life left in him as I do, if Jesus had the same talents and gifts that I do. If Jesus lived where I live, if Jesus did what I do, what would Jesus do with the rest of his life? I don't think that's an easy question to answer. I think it's actually a question that I can spend the rest of my life working out. If Jesus had as much energy as you have, if Jesus had as much health as you have, if he was in the same stage of life that you find yourself in right now, if he was the mother, the father, the husband, the wife, the boyfriend, or the girlfriend that you are, if he was as young as you are, or as old as you are, what would Jesus do? Would he spend his money the way that you're spending yours? Would he spend his spare time in the way that you're spending yours? What parties would Jesus go to? Jesus did go to parties, and he enjoyed a very full social life, actually, if you read the Gospels. Where would Jesus go for vacation? These are fundamental, core questions that we need to ask if we're going to be serious about seeing people the way that Jesus sees people. Each of us needs to discover what it is Jesus would do if he were limited to what you have to offer. And then just do it. I thought this would get Jeff excited. In an episode of the second season of The Simpsons, do you know this episode, Jeff? Lisa falls in love, right? With her substitute teacher, Mr. Bergstrom. I got notes. Mr. Bergstrom. Interestingly, Mr. Bergstrom is Jewish. He's also urbane. He's intelligent. He's strong. He's demanding. He is the only teacher and perhaps the only adult who has ever challenged, respected, and liked Lisa. He is, in effect, Jesus in disguise. And much of the humor of this episode is drawn from the contrast between Mr. Bergstrom, who is like Jesus, and Homer, who is like, well, who's more like us than we care to admit, right? So just as Lisa is about to ask Mr. Bergstrom over to her parents' house for dinner, her regular teacher returns to the classroom. And rushing to the train station, Lisa confesses to Mr. Bergstrom, who is taking a job in capital city, that she will be lost without him. Watch this clip. And Aidan, my sound is up on this.
Now boarding on track 5, the Afternoon
Mr.
Delight,
Bergstrom!
stopping at Shelbyville.
Hey, Mr.
Parkville, and
Bergstrom!
Capital
Hey,
City.
Lisa.
Hey, Lisa, indeed.
What? What is it?
Oh, I mean, were you just gonna leave just like that?
Oh, I'm sorry, Lisa. It's the life of of the substitute teacher. He's a fraud. Today he might be wearing gym shorts. Tomorrow he's speaking French or pretending to know how to run a bandsaw or God knows what.
You can't go. You're the best teacher I'll ever have.
Oh, that's not true. Other teachers will come along.
Oh, please.
No, I can't lie to you. I am the best. But, they need me over in the projects of Capital City.
But I need you too.
That's the problem with being middle class. Anybody who really cares will abandon you for those who need it more.
I understand. Mr. Bergstrom, I'm gonna miss you.
Well, I'll tell you what. Whenever you feel like you're alone and there's nobody you can rely on, this is all you need to know.
Thank you, Mr. Bergstrom.
All aboard!
So, I guess this is it. If you don't mind, I'll just run alongside the train as it speeds you from my life.
Goodbye, Lisa, honey. It'll be okay. Just read the note.
A Jewish man once wrote me a note like that. He wrote it in his own blood. He said to me, "They mocked me, they beat me, they taunted me, and they lied about me. They dragged me up a hill, stripped me naked, anchored me to a cross with nails, and I did it because you are Daryl Buchanan. I am Daryl Buchanan. Apparently, I am worth being crushed, humiliated, and tortured for, and dying for. I am just as scared and broken, as pathetic and needy, and selfish and greedy, and as aggressive and frightened as you are. But you can't take that note from me. It is my most treasured possession. I am Daryl Buchanan. That's how Jesus sees me. Set free from sin, from guilt, and death. And he's sending me out as his ambassador, as his emissary, to see others in the same way, not as objects, but as subjects. Maybe this morning you're here and you've lost what it is to hold that note, so precious. And to know, maybe you've forgotten that your whole identity is bound up in Jesus' sacrifice. And if you're treating people like objects, today you can turn that around. Today you can start seeing people as Jesus sees you, as Jesus sees them. May God refresh and renew our hearts. May God fill our hearts with compassion so that we can see others as Jesus sees them. Amen.